Welcome to Singapore Property Talk Law, your guide to understanding Singapore's exciting property scene. I'm Damien, and I'm so glad you could join us today for this deep dive into a topic that affects us all.
Yeah, sure.
Property cooling
That's
measures.
a big one.
It is a big one, and to help us navigate this maze, we have the amazing Serene with us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Serene, and I'm excited to be here to break down some of those policies that the government's been rolling out for the past 15 years.
15 years, a long time. So before we get into the specifics,
Right.
can you paint the big picture for us, Serene? What's the government's strategy with all these measures?
Well, you know how everyone's always talking about how hot the Singapore property market is?
Yeah.
It's like it's always on fire,
All
and
right.
the government is trying to, well, they're not trying to put out the fire.
Right.
They're trying to, tame it a little bit, you know?
Yeah, make it manageable.
Exactly. So affordability is a big concern, of course. But it's not just about bringing prices down. They also want to prevent crazy speculation, which could destabilize the whole market. You know? It's like they're walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to keep things balanced.
So how have they been doing that over the years?
It's been a series of moves, almost like a dance. You know, they
Yeah.
adjust a little here, a little there. If we go back to 2009, right after that global financial crisis,
Yeah.
that's when we start to see the government capping the brakes a little bit.
Okay.
They removed some schemes that made it easier to defer loan payments.
I see. So encouraging people to be a bit more cautious,
Exactly, just a little nudge in the right direction.
a gentle tap on the brakes,
Yeah.
not a full-on stop.
Yeah, exactly. But then things started to heat up.
Okay.
And by 2010, they were rolling out more targeted measures.
Right. So 2010 was a big year.
It was. And this is where we see the introduction of the seller's stamp duty.
SSD.
Yeah, SSD for short. Have you ever thought about flipping a property, Damien?
Well, I think anyone who's interested in property has at least considered it.
Right. A quick buy and sell for a profit.
Who doesn't love a quick buck?
Exactly. But the SSD made that a lot less appealing.
How so?
Well, it added a hefty tax if you sold within a certain time frame.
So you couldn't just buy and sell quickly without any consequences.
Nope. Initially, that time frame was just 1 year,
Huh.
but then it increased to 3 years, then 4 years, and the rates went up too.
Wow. So the message was clear. Think long term.
Long-term ownership, not quick profits.
Stability.
Exactly.
Now, apart from the SSD, what other measures did they introduce around that time?
Well, remember affordability being a key concern.
Right.
They wanted to make sure people weren't overstretching themselves financially. So they introduced loan-to-value limits, or LTVs.
LTVs, I've heard of those.
Yeah, basically, they started lowering the LTV limit in 2010. This meant buyers needed bigger down payments.
Oh, so they couldn't borrow as much?
Exactly. It made it harder to take on more debt than they could handle.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So 2010 was a turning point with the SSD and the first LTV reductions. But the government wasn't done yet, were they?
Not even close. 2011 was a huge year for cooling measures.
Oh, really?
Maybe the most significant of them all. They kept tightening the SSD. But the big news was the additional buyer's stamp duty.
Ah, the ABSD, the one that makes buyers groan.
That's the one. It made buying a property significantly more expensive, especially for foreigners and people buying their second or third property.
So it was aimed at cooling down investment demand.
Precisely. They wanted to prioritize homes for Singaporeans.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got the SSD targeting flippers and the ABSD aimed at investors.
Yeah.
Anything else they threw into the mix around this time?
Well, there's the LTV limits we talked about.
Right.
Those got tightened even further in late 2010 and again in 2011.
So it was getting progressively harder to borrow large sums.
It was. And then in 2013...
Wait, before we jump to 2013, there's another measure they introduced that year that feels incredibly relevant, especially for anyone juggling multiple loans, not just mortgages. Tell us about the TDSR.
Yes, the total debt servicing ratio, or TDSR. This one was introduced mid-2013.
Mid-2013, okay.
Yeah, think of it as a financial health check, you know, making sure you're not taking on more debt than you can handle.
So it's like a safeguard.
Exactly. It looks at all your debt obligations, not just your potential mortgage, and caps how much you can borrow based on your income.
So your car loan, credit card debts, personal loans, all of that.
It all gets factored in. It encourages responsible borrowing and prevents people from getting in over their heads.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
So by 2013, we've got SSD, ABSD, tightened LTVs, and the TDSR all working together to cool things down. What a whirlwind. What happened next in this property saga?
It's a bit like building a house, layer by layer.
Yeah, adding more and more measures.
Exactly. And we can't forget about 2013, the year the government really doubled down.
Okay, 2013. This is where things get even more interesting.
Yeah.
What did they focus on that year?
Remember the ABSD we talked about?
The additional buyer stamp duty.
That's the one. Well, in 2013, those rates went up across the board.
How much did they increase by?
For instance, for a Singaporean buying their second property,
Hmm.
the ABSD jumped from 3% to 7%, and for their third or subsequent property, it went all the way to 10%.
Wow, so they were really trying to deter those who already own properties.
They were, and permanent residents and foreigners saw even bigger hikes.
So the message was clear. Don't buy too many properties.
It wasn't just about the ABSD, though. They also adjusted the LTV limits that year.
Right. The loan-to-value limits. Those got tightened too, didn't they?
They did. It was getting tougher to borrow large sums for property purchases.
It seems like they were pulling out all the stops to cool down the market.
They were. But, the market is always evolving.
It's like a living thing.
Exactly. And these measures need to be adjusted in response. Fast forward to 2017, and we see a slight easing of the SSD.
Oh, really? So a bit of a break for sellers.
Yeah, the holding period was reduced back to 3 years.
Okay, so a little bit of breathing room,
Yeah.
but not a complete shift in strategy.
No, not at all. The government was still very much focused on keeping the market stable. And then came 2018.
2018, another pivotal year. What happened then?
2018 brought another wave of tightening. Both the ABSD rates and the LTV limits were adjusted again.
Some more cooling measures.
More cooling measures. A foreigner looking to buy a condo in 2018 would suddenly face a 20% ABSD.
Up from 15% the year before. That's a significant increase.
It is. And they also tightened the LTV limits for bank loans, making it even harder to borrow.
So they were really trying to keep foreign investment in check.
They were trying to manage it carefully.
So we had a few years of relative calm, then bam, another round of cooling measures in 2018. Did things settle down after that?
For a little while.
Yeah.
But by 2021, the market was showing signs of overheating again, and the government decided it was time to intervene.
2021, here we go again. What happened that year?
You guessed it. More ABSD hikes and tighter borrowing limits. They increased the ABSD for Singaporeans buying their second property to 17%.
17%. Wow.
And for their third or subsequent properties, it went up to 25%.
25%. That's a lot.
It is. Permanent residents and foreigners also saw increases. It was a pretty big move.
It sounds like they were serious about cooling things down. What about those borrowing limits? How are those tightened?
Well, they reduced the TDSR threshold from 60% to 55%.
So squeezing that borrowing capacity even further.
Exactly. And they also lowered the LTV limit for HDB loans from 90% to 85%.
Requiring larger down payments.
It was a multi-pronged approach to keep the market in check.
So they were pulling out all the stops again? And then came 2022, another year of adjustments.
Right. Again, 2022 was all about managing potential risks. They were concerned about interest rate hikes, so they introduced a higher assumed interest rate for assessing borrowers.
Interesting. So even if interest rates were low at the time, banks had to factor in a higher rate when calculating affordability.
Exactly. It was like a built-in safety net to protect borrowers from future increases.
That's actually quite clever. What else did they do that year?
They also lowered the LTV limit for HDB loans again, from 85% to 80%.
So even bigger down payments.
Yep. Promoting responsible borrowing was key. And then in 2023 came the move that really made headlines.
2023 was a big year. What happened?
The ABSD for foreigners buying any residential property was doubled.
Doubled. Wow. What was the new rate?
It went from 30% to a staggering 60%.
60%. That's
Yeah.
huge.
It was a clear signal that they were prioritizing homeownership for Singaporeans. And then we come to 2024.
So last year, did they ease up on the cooling measures at all?
Well, they made a significant adjustment to the LTV limit for HDB loans, lowering it to 75%,
75%.
which brought it in line with the LTV limit for bank loans.
I see. So level playing field for borrowers. But lowering the LTV limit even further must have made it tougher for some buyers to enter the market. Did they do anything to balance that out?
They did. They increased the enhanced CPF housing grant significantly to support first-time buyers, especially those in the lower to middle income bracket.
Okay, so they provided more support for certain buyers. It's like they're constantly adjusting the dials trying to find that sweet spot.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act.
It really is. So after 15 years of these cooling measures, have they actually worked?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. Have they actually cooled down the market?
Well, it's not a simple yes or no answer.
I figured as much.
Remember we talked about how property prices have been rising steadily since 2009?
Yeah, almost 88% for HDB resale
Yeah.
and over 106% for private property.
Exactly. Those increases have happened despite all the cooling measures.
So on the surface, it seems like they haven't really stopped prices from going up.
Right, but it's hard to say for sure what would happen without any intervention.
That's true. It's like a what-if scenario.
Exactly. Prices might have risen even more dramatically.
So maybe the cooling measures have helped to moderate the rate of increase.
That's a good way to put it.
Instead of a steep climb, it's been more of a gradual incline,
And we also have to remember the other objectives the government is trying to achieve,
right? Like ensuring housing affordability,
especially for first-time buyers.
like with the enhanced CPF housing grant we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between controlling prices and making sure people can still afford to buy homes.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this, what's the key takeaway here?
I think the most important thing is to understand that the property market is constantly changing.
It's dynamic.
Exactly. These cooling measures are just one part of that, and they'll continue to be adjusted as needed.
So staying informed is crucial.
Absolutely. Do your research, understand how these measures might affect your decisions.
Don't just jump into the market blindly.
Exactly. Buying a property is a big decision.
It is.
Don't get caught up in the hype. Take your time. Assess your financial situation. And don't be afraid to seek professional advice.
Sound advice, Serene. So to wrap things up, what's the one question our listeners should be pondering as they navigate this complex world of Singapore property?
With all these cooling measures in place and the government's plans to increase housing supply, are we entering a buyer's market, or is Singapore's property market just too hot to handle?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with.
Yeah.
It's definitely a dynamic situation, and the answer might not be clear-cut. But staying informed and understanding the market will put you in a much stronger position.
Whether you're buying or selling.
Well said, Serene. Thanks for joining us on Singapore Property Talk Law.
It's been my pleasure, Damien.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the fascinating world of Singapore property. Until then, happy property hunting.